Dr. Arya Chen had attended enough diplomatic functions to know that the really important conversations never happened in the conference rooms. They happened in the spaces between, the corridors where translators whispered corrections, the service alcoves where security personnel shared intelligence, and the observation decks where people went to think thoughts they couldn't voice in public. Which was why she wasn't surprised to find herself studying xenolinguistic patterns in the ship's most remote viewport rather than networking with the other human delegates. The peace negotiations between the Colonial Assembly and the Karelian Empire had been proceeding with all the enthusiasm of a funeral dirge, and Arya suspected the real breakthrough would come from understanding what wasn't being said rather than parsing the formal diplomatic language. The Karelian subjunctive tense implies conditional trust, she muttered to herself, reviewing her notes from the day's session. But their translator keeps using the declarative form when rendering human statements. Either she's incompetent, or she's deliberately creating linguistic distance. The translator in question was an enigma wrapped in concealing robes. Zephyra, she called herself, though Arya suspected that wasn't her real name. Most translators were chosen for their ability to blend into diplomatic settings, becoming invisible conduits for communication. Zephyra was the opposite, a presence that seemed to absorb light and attention despite her obvious efforts to avoid both. Arya had caught glimpses of violet skin beneath the heavy hood, and the woman's ears were distinctly non-human in their elongated, pointed structure. But it was her voice that fascinated Arya most, an instrument of remarkable precision that could shift between the clicking consonants of Karelian formal speech and the flowing vowels of colonial standard without missing a beat. Dr. Chen. The voice in question startled Arya from her linguistic reverie. She turned to find Zephyra standing in the observation deck's entrance, her robes rustling with nervous energy. Even concealed, she moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to potential violence, weight balanced, hands positioned for quick action. "Please, call me Arya," she said, setting aside her data pad. "I was just reviewing today's translation patterns. Your work is remarkable, by the way. I've never heard anyone navigate Karelian honorific structures so smoothly." A pause. "Then, you were listening to the linguistic patterns rather than the content?" "Occupational hazard," Arya admitted. "I'm a xenolinguist. I study how different species use language to construct meaning and relationships. Sometimes the how is more revealing than the what." Zephyra moved further into the observation deck, but kept her distance from the viewport. "And what did my translations reveal?" "That you're working very hard to prevent either side from accidentally insulting the other," Arya said. "The Karelians keep using possessive constructions that would imply human subordination, and the colonial delegates keep employing casual language that reads as disrespectful in formal Karelian. You've been smoothing both sides without either realizing it." "Translation is not merely converting words," Zephyra said carefully. "It is building bridges across chasms of understanding." "Exactly." Arya's enthusiasm bubbled over. "Most people think translation is just linguistic mathematics, swap word A for word B and meaning transfers perfectly. But you understand that meaning lives in the spaces between languages, in the cultural assumptions and emotional contexts that native speakers carry unconsciously." For the first time, Zephyra seemed to relax slightly. Few recognize the complexity. Most assume translation is a mechanical process. "Those people have clearly never tried to explain human humor to a Centaurian," Arya said with a grin. "I once spent 3 hours attempting to translate the concept of sarcasm to a delegation from Alpha Centauri. They kept asking why humans would say the opposite of what they meant and then become frustrated when taken literally." A sound that might have been laughter came from within Zephyra's hood. "How did you resolve it?" "I told them sarcasm was a human defense mechanism, a way of expressing disagreement while maintaining social cohesion. They found that fascinating and immediately began cataloging 17 different types of human verbal deflection strategies." 17 types. 18, actually, but I didn't have the heart to explain passive-aggressive compliments. They were already taking notes at a rate that suggested they planned to write academic papers. This time the laugh was unmistakable, a musical sound that seemed to carry harmonics from some deeper register. You made translation into anthropological study. Everything's anthropological study if you approach it with sufficient curiosity, Arya said. Which reminds me, I've been wondering about your accent. There's something underneath the standard patterns, a phonetic structure I can't identify. Would you mind if I asked about your linguistic background? The relaxed atmosphere evaporated instantly. Zephyra's posture shifted back into defensive tension, and her hands disappeared into her robe sleeves. I learned many languages during my travels, she said carefully. Arya sensed she'd stumbled into sensitive territory, but her scientist's curiosity warred with her social awareness. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's just that from a research perspective, multilingual acquisition patterns can reveal fascinating insights about cognitive flexibility and cultural adaptation. But if it's personal. Everything is personal when you have lived as I have lived, Zephyra interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that suggested pain running deeper than linguistic academic interest could reach. Before Arya could respond, the ship's communication system chimed with an announcement from the bridge. Attention all personnel. Due to a malfunction in the environmental systems, all personnel are required to remove non-essential clothing and equipment that might interfere with atmospheric recycling. This includes ceremonial robes, decorative masks, and cultural concealment garments. Standard diplomatic immunity protocols remain in effect. Arya watched Zephyra's reaction with growing concern. The alien woman had gone completely still, her breathing shallow and rapid. It's probably just a standard precaution, Arya said gently. Environmental malfunctions are common on older ships. The recycling systems need to identify and process all materials to prevent contamination. You do not understand, Zephyr whispered. I cannot. I will not. But the ship's security protocols were already engaging, automatically scanning for concealed materials and flagging anomalies. Within moments, Zephyra's heavy robes were identified as potential atmospheric contaminants, and the ship's AI began the mandatory decontamination sequence. Arya watched in helpless sympathy as Zephyra's concealment was slowly stripped away, revealing the truth she had worked so desperately to hide. Zephyra's skin was the deep violet of a nebula at sunset, marked with intricate patterns of raised scars that traced across her arms, neck, and the visible portions of her face. The scars weren't random, they formed deliberate geometric designs that spoke of intentional artistry, though the artistry in question appeared to have been carved with something considerably sharper than aesthetic concern. Arya's breath caught, not from revulsion but from recognition. She'd seen similar scarification patterns in her xenoanthropological studies, ritual markings used by various cultures across the galaxy to denote everything from social status to spiritual achievement. But these scars carried a different weight, a precision that suggested pain rather than ceremony. Vorthak ownership marks, Zephyra said quietly, her voice stripped of the musical quality Arya had begun to associate with her. Each pattern indicates rank, function, and market value. I was branded as a Class 7 translator warrior, specializing in diplomatic languages and close-quarters combat. The casual way she recited this information made Arya's stomach clench. The Vorthak Empire fell decades ago. Yes. Zephyra's elongated ears drooped as she examined her reflection in the observation port's surface. But their artwork remains permanent. Etherian skin holds scars like memory, they never fade, never heal completely smooth. Arya moved closer, studying the patterns with professional curiosity overriding social awkwardness. These aren't just ownership marks. Some of these designs are incredibly complex, almost like mathematical equations rendered in scar tissue. The Vorthak believed that pain enhanced cognitive function, Zephyra explained, unconsciously tracing one of the raised lines along her forearm. Translators received additional scarification to improve our linguistic processing abilities. The more languages we mastered, the more elaborate the patterns became. That's horrible, Arya said, then immediately worried she'd been too blunt. I mean, the forced modification, not the result. These patterns are actually quite beautiful from an artistic standpoint, though I can't imagine the circumstances were. You think they are beautiful? Zephyra turned from the viewport, her amber eyes wide with something between surprise and disbelief. Arya realized she'd wandered into territory that required careful navigation. I think they're part of your story. And stories, even painful ones, have their own kind of beauty. The fact that you survived whatever created these marks, that you learned languages under those conditions and became skilled enough to serve as a diplomatic translator, that's remarkable. My own people do not share your perspective, Zephyra said bitterly. Etherian skin naturally shifts through spectrum colors based on emotion and health. The scarification process locks the pigmentation permanently. This violet shade indicates shame in our color language. I am marked as fundamentally damaged. That's their loss, Arya said with more heat than she'd intended. Any culture that judges someone's worth based on scars they didn't choose to receive is missing the point entirely. Zephyra stared at her. You truly mean that? Of course I mean it. Look, I've spent my career studying how different species construct meaning through language and cultural symbols. Every civilization has markers for success, beauty, worth, and most of them are completely arbitrary. Humans used to judge people based on skin color, which is possibly the stupidest criteria ever devised since melanin content has exactly zero correlation with character, intelligence, or ability. But surely your people have evolved beyond such superficial judgments. Arya snorted. You should see the comments section on any human social media platform. We've made progress, but we're still working on it. The difference is, we've started recognizing that our prejudices are problems to solve rather than natural law to enforce. For the first time since her concealment had been removed, Zephyra smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. You are unusual, Arya Chen. I get that a lot, Arya admitted. Usually right before someone explains why my research methodology is questionable or my theories are too optimistic about interspecies cooperation. Your theories. I believe that communication barriers between species are usually emotional rather than linguistic. Most translation problems stem from assumptions about intent rather than actual meaning confusion. When I can get species representatives to stop being defensive long enough to actually listen to each other, breakthrough happens remarkably quickly. Zephyra considered this. Is that why you were studying my translation patterns? Partially. But also because I was curious about you specifically. You navigate multiple linguistic frameworks with remarkable fluency, but there's something in your translation choices that suggests you're working from personal experience rather than just academic training. What do you mean? You don't just translate words, you translate pain. When the Karelian delegate spoke about acceptable losses in territorial disputes, you rendered it as regrettable necessities in colonial standard. That's not linguistic accuracy, that's emotional diplomacy. You know what it feels like to be considered an acceptable loss. Zephyra's violet skin seemed to deepen in color. The Vorthak considered all slaves acceptable losses. We were tools, valuable enough to maintain, but ultimately replaceable. When the empire fell, many former slaves found themselves without homes, families, or identities beyond their assigned functions. Is that why you work as a translator? Because it's familiar? Because it is useful, Zephyra corrected. And because language was the one skill the Vorthak gave me that I could reclaim as my own. They taught me to serve their purposes, but I learned to serve mine as well. Before Arya could respond, the ship's alert systems began chiming urgently. Through the observation port, they could see the distinctive energy signatures of Karelian war vessels dropping out of hyperspace, far more ships than had been expected for a peaceful diplomatic mission. That's not the scheduled reinforcement patrol, Arya said, her diplomatic training recognizing the formation patterns immediately. Zephyra moved to the viewport with predatory grace, her scarred hands already reaching for weapons that weren't there. No. That is a battle fleet, and they are moving into attack formation. Attack formation? But we're in neutral space, conducting peace negotiations under Galactic treaty protection. Treaties are paper constructs, Zephyra said grimly, her translator's diplomatic demeanor replaced by something much more dangerous. Ships are reality. And those ships are here for someone specific. She turned from the viewport to face Arya, and the expression in her amber eyes carried the weight of someone who'd learned not to expect happy endings. They are here for me. The bridge of the research vessel Harmony erupted into controlled chaos as the Corellian battle fleet established a perimeter around their position. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried the steady calm of someone who'd navigated diplomatic crises before, but Arya could see the tension in his shoulders as he coordinated with both human and Corellian command structures. Admiral Thane, Rodriguez said into the comm system, "This is a neutral vessel operating under diplomatic immunity. Please state your intentions." The response came through with the distinctive harmonic distortion of Corellian military encryption. Captain Rodriguez, we require the immediate surrender of the war criminal known as Zephyra. She will be transferred to Corellian custody for trial under military tribunal protocols. Arya felt Zephyra stiffen beside her as they stood in the bridge's observation area. The alien woman had been granted temporary diplomatic status as an essential translator, but that protection seemed fragile against the firepower arrayed outside their viewports. War criminal. Arya whispered. What is he talking about? I killed his brother, Zephyr replied quietly, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting established facts. During my escape from the gladiatorial pits on Vortex Station 7. Admiral Thane's younger brother was serving as a guard commander when I led the prisoner uprising. You led a prisoner uprising? Arya stared at her. How is that a war crime? That sounds like justified rebellion against slavery. Corellian law does not distinguish between justified and unjustified killing, Zephyra explained. A life was taken, therefore debt must be paid. Admiral Thane has been tracking me for 7 years. Captain Rodriguez continued his diplomatic dance with increasing frustration. Admiral, this individual is currently serving as an official translator for recognized peace negotiations. Any interference with diplomatic personnel constitutes an act of aggression under Article 7 of the Galactic Accords. The Galactic Accords do not supersede Corellian military justice, came Thane's reply. However, we are willing to observe proper tribunal protocols. The accused may invoke trial by combat if she believes her actions were justified under Warriors Code. Arya's xenolinguistic training kicked in immediately. Wait a minute, she said, pulling up her research files on her portable data pad. Trial by combat in Corellian law, that's not just ritual violence. There are specific provisions for defendants who acted in defense of others. It matters little, Zephyra said with resignation. I would face Admiral Thane himself, and he is considered one of the finest warriors in the Corellian military. I have been a translator for 7 years, not a gladiator. My combat skills have atrophied. Not necessarily, Arya said, her fingers flying across her data pad. Look at this, Corellian Tribunal Code, Section 12. If the defendant can prove she acted to protect non-combatants, she gains the right to choose a champion or invoke diplomatic protection from any recognized government representative. Diplomatic protection. If someone with official standing vouches for your character and takes responsibility for your actions, the trial becomes a matter of honor rather than justice. The accuser has to prove not just that you killed someone, but that you're fundamentally unworthy of protection. Zephyra looked at her with something like hope flickering in her amber eyes. You believe this would work? I believe it's worth trying, Arya said. But we need to understand exactly what happened during your escape. The details matter for the legal defense. As the two women huddled over Arya's research, Captain Rodriguez continued his increasingly tense negotiations with Admiral Thane. The Corellian fleet hadn't opened fire, but their weapon systems were obviously charged and ready. Tell me about the uprising, Arya said. Everything you remember. Zephyra closed her eyes, her scarred hands clenching unconsciously. Vortex Station 7 housed approximately 3,000 slaves from 17 different species. The guards numbered fewer than 200, but they had superior weapons and defensive positions. The uprising was not planned. It began when the guards decided to execute a group of sick prisoners rather than waste medical resources on them. Sick prisoners. Karelian civilians who had been captured during a border skirmish. Admiral Thane's brother, Commander Thane, had been given responsibility for their welfare. When disease broke out in their section, he decided elimination was more efficient than treatment. Arya felt her stomach turn. He was going to execute 6 civilians. Standard Vorthak protocol, Zephyra said bitterly. Efficiency over compassion. But I had been assigned to translate for the Karelian prisoners, to explain their situation and obtain cooperation. I could not watch children be murdered for economic convenience. Children. 17 Karelian young, ages 6 to 15. Their families had been killed in the border incident, and they were being held as potential bargaining tools. When Commander Thane decided they were more valuable dead than alive. You intervened. I killed him with his own ceremonial blade and opened the containment cells. The uprising that followed was not elegant or planned. It was desperate people fighting for the right to live another day. Arya absorbed this information, her mind racing through the legal implications. Zephyra, you didn't commit a war crime. You prevented a massacre. Those children, did any of them survive? All of them. The uprising succeeded, and we commandeered several Vorthak transports. I ensured the Karelian civilians reached safety before I disappeared into the Outer Rim territories. Then we have our defense, Arya said firmly. You acted to protect non-combatants, including Karelian children. Admiral Thane isn't seeking justice, he's seeking revenge. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried across the bridge as his patience finally reached its limit. Admiral Thane, I'm going to need a formal legal justification for this action, or I'll be forced to consider your fleet's presence an act of aggression against a diplomatic mission. Captain, Thane's voice carried cold fury, you are harboring a murderer who killed my brother in cold blood. Justice will be served. Arya stood up, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Captain Rodriguez, I request permission to invoke diplomatic protection protocols under Karelian tribunal law. Dr. Chen. The captain turned to look at her with surprise. What are you talking about? I'm officially claiming responsibility for Zephyra's actions and requesting that any tribunal proceedings be conducted under diplomatic protection guidelines. As a recognized government representative of the Colonial Assembly, I have the legal standing to make this claim. Zephyra grabbed her arm. Arya, you cannot. If the tribunal rules against me, you would share the consequences. You could face Karelian military justice yourself. Arya looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the violet skin, the intricate scars, the elongated ears, and the amber eyes that held so much pain and courage. Why do you find me beautiful? Zephyra whispered, unconsciously echoing the question that had haunted her for years. I'm ugly, human. Scarred and damaged and marked by violence. Arya didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out and gently touched one of the raised scars along Zephyra's jaw. A mark that spoke of survival, of choosing to live when dying would have been easier. And she smiled. The tribunal convened in the Harmony's main conference hall, transformed now into a formal court by the addition of Karelian ceremonial banners and recording equipment. Admiral Thane had transported aboard with a full honor guard, his bearing radiating the controlled fury of someone who'd waited 7 years for this moment. Arya had spent the intervening hours researching every aspect of Karelian tribunal law she could access, while Zephyra sat in meditation, preparing herself for what she clearly expected to be her final battle. The alien woman had accepted Arya's protection with gratitude, but her amber eyes held the resignation of someone who'd learned not to hope for happy endings. This tribunal will determine the guilt or innocence of the accused in the matter of Commander Thane's death, Admiral Thane announced, his voice carrying the ceremonial weight of military tradition. The accused may speak in her own defense, or her protector may speak for her. Arya stood, her xenolinguistic training helping her navigate the formal speech patterns required by Karelian law. Admiral Thane, I speak for Zephyra under diplomatic protection. We do not dispute that Commander Thane died by her hand. We dispute the characterization of his death as criminal. My brother was murdered while serving his duty, Thane replied coldly. What possible justification exists for such an act? The justification of preventing the execution of 17 innocent children, Arya said, her voice carrying across the assembled witnesses, human diplomats, Karelian officers, and various alien observers who'd requested permission to attend. A murmur ran through the Karelian delegation. Admiral Thane's expression didn't change, but several of his officers exchanged glances. Elaborate, Thane demanded. Arya activated her data pad, displaying the records she'd compiled. Vorthak Station 7 prisoner logs, recovered during the Empire's collapse and filed with the Galactic War Crimes Tribunal. On the date in question, Commander Thane issued orders for the execution of 43 prisoners designated as economically inefficient. 17 of these prisoners were Karelian children, ages 6 to 15. That is impossible, one of Thane's officers interjected. Karelian military code strictly forbids harm to non-combatant children under any circumstances. Yet the orders exist, Arya replied, transmitting the documents to the tribunal's display system. Commander Thane's signature, authenticated by Vorthak administrative systems. Execution scheduled for economic reasons, specifically, the cost of medical treatment during a disease outbreak. Admiral Thane studied the documents, his face growing increasingly pale. These records, this cannot be accurate. I was there, Zephyra said quietly, speaking for the first time since the tribunal began. I translated your brother's orders to the prisoners. I watched their faces when they understood that their children would die not for military necessity, not for strategic advantage, but because treating sick children was considered wasteful. You lie, Thane said, but his voice lacked conviction. Admiral, Arya continued, the Galactic War Crimes Tribunal interviewed survivors from Vorthak Station 7. 47 independent witnesses confirmed that the uprising began when execution orders were issued for sick prisoners, including Karelian children. Your brother died defending a policy that violated every principle of Karelian military honor. The silence that followed was broken by one of Thane's own officers, a younger Karelian with the bearing of someone struggling with unwelcome revelations. Admiral, the officer said carefully, I served under Commander Thane briefly before his assignment to Station 7. There were concerns about his methods. His superior officers felt he had become too influenced by Vorthak efficiency doctrines. Thane turned on his subordinate with fury. You dare question my brother's honor? I question orders to execute children, the officer replied steadily. As would any Karelian warrior worthy of the name. Arya seized the moment. Admiral, this tribunal isn't about your brother's death. It's about the choice Zephyra made when confronted with the murder of innocents. She chose to act, knowing it might cost her life, because letting children die was unacceptable. She is a slave, Thane said desperately. She had no authority to make such choices. She had the authority of conscience, Arya replied. The same authority that Karelian military code grants to any warrior who witnesses crimes against non-combatants. Your own law requires soldiers to disobey orders that violate fundamental principles of honor. Zephyra stood slowly, her violet skin seeming to shimmer in the tribunal chamber's lighting. Admiral Thane, I killed your brother because he intended to murder children. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. But I will not apologize for choosing their lives over his orders. The challenge hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Admiral Thane stared at Zephyra, his expression cycling through rage, grief, and something that might have been recognition. The children, he said finally. The 17 Karelian children. What became of them? I ensured their safe transport to Karelian space during the uprising, Zephyra replied. They were returned to surviving family members or placed with appropriate guardians according to your cultural traditions. You saved them. It was the right thing to do. Admiral Thane looked around the tribunal chamber, taking in the faces of his officers, the human diplomats, and the various alien observers. Finally, his gaze settled on Arya. Dr. Chen, you claim diplomatic protection for this individual. Do you understand the full implications of that claim? I understand that Zephyr acted with courage and compassion in an impossible situation, Arya replied. I understand that she saved 17 children from execution and countless other prisoners from continued slavery. I understand that she spent 7 years living in fear of retribution for doing what any decent person would have done. And you believe she deserves protection despite her appearance? The question carried weight that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Arya looked at Zephyr, at the intricate scars that told stories of survival, at the violet skin that spoke of trauma overcome, at the amber eyes that held courage earned through pain. Admiral, Arya said quietly, I find her beautiful. The words carried across the chamber with perfect clarity. Zephyr's eyes widened, her scarred hands trembling slightly as she processed what she'd heard. Beautiful? Thane asked. This scarred creature who killed my brother? This remarkable woman who saved your children, Arya corrected. Beauty isn't about perfect skin or unmarked bodies, Admiral. It's about the choices we make when everything is at stake. It's about standing up for what's right even when it costs us everything. It's about surviving trauma and choosing to help others instead of letting pain make us cruel. Zephyr's violet skin began to shift, subtle color variations rippling across her arms and face, the first sign of natural Etherian chromatophore activity Arya had witnessed. Why do you find me beautiful? Zephyr whispered, her voice breaking. I'm ugly, human. Scarred and damaged. Arya reached out and took Zephyr's scarred hand in hers, intertwining their fingers. She didn't answer with words, didn't try to explain the complexity of seeing strength in survival, grace in endurance, and profound beauty in someone who chose compassion despite carrying so much pain. Instead, she simply looked at Zephyr with eyes that held no judgment, no pity, no desire to change or fix or improve. Just acceptance, admiration, and something deeper that made Zephyr's breath catch. And she smiled. In that smile, Zephyr saw herself reflected not as a damaged thing to be hidden, but as someone worthy of protection, respect, and genuine affection. The violet of her skin began shifting toward deeper purples and blues, colors that in Etherian culture indicated peace, healing, and hope. Admiral Thane watched this exchange with the expression of someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. Finally, he spoke. This tribunal finds that the accused acted in accordance with the highest principles of warrior honor, he announced formally. Commander Thane's death, while tragic, was the result of his failure to uphold the sacred duty to protect non-combatants. The charges are dismissed. He paused, looking directly at Zephyr. I owe you an apology. And a debt. Those children you saved, one of them was my nephew. The revelation hung in the air like a gift no one had expected. Zephyr's skin shifted again, this time toward the silver-gold spectrum that indicated profound surprise. Your nephew. My brother's son, captured during the border incident along with his cousins and friends. You gave him back his life, and I have spent 7 years trying to punish you for it. Thane's voice carried the weight of recognition. I was wrong. As the tribunal officially concluded and the various delegations began to disperse, Arya found herself alone with Zephyr in the observation deck where their conversation had begun hours earlier. You truly meant what you said, Zephyr said quietly, studying their reflection in the viewport. About finding me beautiful. Every word, Arya replied. Though I probably should have mentioned it before the formal tribunal. Declaring someone beautiful in front of a military court wasn't exactly in my diplomatic playbook. Your diplomatic playbook needs updating, Zephyr said, and there was laughter in her voice, the musical sound Arya had grown to cherish. Most translators do not inspire such passionate defenses. Most translators don't lead prison uprisings to save children, Arya pointed out. Also, most translators don't have your particular combination of linguistic brilliance, moral courage, and... She gestured vaguely, general amazingness. General amazingness? It's a technical term in xenolinguistics, Arya said with mock seriousness. It refers to the quality possessed by individuals who make academic conferences infinitely more interesting just by existing. Zephyr's skin rippled with colors Arya was beginning to recognize as amusement and affection. And what does your technical analysis suggest we do now? Well, Arya said, moving closer to the viewport where their reflections merged in the starlight, I was thinking we could start with dinner. Somewhere that appreciates the beauty of survival stories and doesn't judge people based on their scars. And after dinner? After dinner, we figure out how to build a life together across species barriers, cultural differences, and the occasional interdimensional diplomatic crisis. Arya grinned. Should be easy for a brilliant translator and a xenolinguist who specializes in impossible communication problems. Zephyr looked at their combined reflection. Her violet skin with its intricate scarred patterns, Arya's unmarked human features, their hands intertwined against the backdrop of infinite stars. Why do you find me beautiful? She asked one final time, but now the question carried wonder instead of pain. Arya's answer was wordless, a smile that contained acceptance, admiration, and the promise of futures built on seeing each other clearly and choosing love anyway. In that smile, Zephyr finally understood that beauty had nothing to do with unmarked skin or perfect features. It lived in the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to protect others, and the grace to accept love when it arrived wearing the face of an impossible stranger who saw scars as stories and difference as gift. For the first time in 7 years, she felt whole.